So I'm excited to get to talk with you today about CDS hooks, and I was originally going to give you more of a deep dive into Sync for Science, but I got to team up with PJ in yesterday's session, which means we get to talk about something a little different today. I'm hoping this is going to be a pretty quick introduction to a new specification that we've been working on that builds on top of Smart Health IT. And if we've got a minute or two at the end, maybe I'll show you one bit of bonus content from the Sync for Science topic. But I want to give you a little bit of motivation for this CDS hooks project, which is, first of all, here's a characterization of where Smart is today and the kinds of things you can do when you're building a Smart on FHIR app. So first of all, we try to make it easy for anyone in the community to learn what apps are out there, for developers to list the apps that they've built, and for clinicians and folks on the hospital side, and patients as well, to learn what apps are out there. So the app gallery at apps.fhir.org gives you an easy entry point for that kind of discovery. And then within this environment, you might learn about some apps that you want to run and then go figure out by looking at the listing here, well, is it available inside of an Epic system or a Cerner system or an Allscripts system? So that's sort of the entry point or the discovery point. And from there, you would work with a hospital to get one of these apps installed and available locally for your clinicians and configure the EHR to make that app available at the click of a button. So there's a click to launch paradigm where a clinician can, within the context of an EHR session, launch one of these apps. And then, of course, there's the security model to make sure that there's authorization and authentication for these apps, and to make sure the apps know about the context around them, know who the user is and what patient record is open, and to give these apps access to clinical data through the FHIR API. And that starts to become a really compelling story for developers, as you've heard several times over the course of the last day of sessions here, to get started very quickly, building apps that are relatively simple to deploy in a clinical environment. So it's really exciting progress that we've made, but I want to highlight a couple of the workflow challenges that emerge once we start to have this kind of success. What are some of the issues with this kind of click to launch paradigm? So one question is, well, what apps can I actually run? And if a user has to click through a set of menus or search for the right buttons for the apps that they can run, it's not all sort of ideas in their head. And you might actually forget that there's a particular tool that would be useful for you right now. And you might have a large collection of apps that are available to you that only turn out to be relevant a small portion of the time. They might be very relevant when they're relevant, but they only matter for a number of patients who have had a particular lab test or who have a particular diagnosis. And so that becomes a challenge for clinicians knowing which apps to run and when to run them. That's sort of one of the pain points that we'll see when we're successful. Now, it's also worth saying that the interactions that a user is having with the EHR and launching an app and going through a set of visualizations, this is really the tip of an iceberg in an EHR system. But under the hood, there is a lot of business logic that's running, keeping track of incoming results, firing off a set of rules, generating messages and orders to be signed. And so when we're talking about the app layer, it's still a pretty thin piece on top. So CDS hooks is trying to get at some of these challenges of working with a collection of apps that's growing over time and maybe growing faster than clinicians might be able to keep up with. So it's an open source project where we're really following the model that Smart Health IT has developed, building open specifications and open reference implementation and working in a really pragmatic way with the vendor community to build something that works with FHIR in a really nice way, that leverages FHIR in all the places that it's useful. And recently we've begun a collaboration with HL7's Clinical Decision Support Working Group as well to align the work that we're doing. But I want to talk briefly through some of the main points of the CDS hooks specification so you can start to get a feel for what it's about, and then we'll do a quick demonstration. So the idea is that while a user is interacting with the EHR, clinician is signed in, they've got a patient record open, they're navigating from screen to screen, they're prescribing a drug, they're writing an order. The EHR is triggering what we call hooks throughout this process. Hooks are these sort of specific events like opening a new patient record or prescribing a drug that we outline in our specification. And when one of these hooks is triggered, the electronic health record system notifies a set of external clinical decision support services that have registered, that are interested in learning about that particular hook. And the CDS service, we'll go through the details, gets to return what are called cards. And these are user interface elements that will be displayed to the clinician in line in the context of their workflow when and where they matter. And we'll talk about the details of how those work. So first off, let's think about hook points that would be interesting for an external service to listen in on, and places that are really decision points where a clinician may want to know something. We've started off by defining a small set of these, but the idea is that there's an open catalog, and over time, this is something that we plan to expand in a controlled way, and also to give people flexibility to define their own hooks where they need them. But to begin with, we found that there's real pragmatic value in, first of all, identifying when a new patient record has been opened. This is a point when a clinician is just starting to think about what's happening in a patient's record and history, and they might want to know which apps or tools are relevant. So we've got a hook that's defined, which is a new patient is being viewed, a new patient record. We have another one that's focused on medication prescribing, and the idea here is to be able to give feedback to a clinician well before they're done writing a prescription, but while they're in the course of actually choosing a drug or a dose for a particular patient. And that's sort of a real-time flavor to it. And then there's another hook that we've defined, which is called order review. And the idea here is that maybe you're creating a set of orders, or maybe some lab tests, some medications, some hospital orders. And in a typical inpatient workflow, there's a sign-off step that happens on a batch of orders all at once. And that's another important decision point where an external service can review that batch of orders and say, does it make sense together? Are there any redundancies? Is there anything missing from that list that you'd like to be able to propose? So any changes, additions, or deletions from that list. And so if you're writing one of these CDS services, the requirements that you have, the responsibilities that you're trying to meet are, number one, to be able to respond in a timely fashion. And the idea is these CDS hooks trigger quickly, and they return in real time for a user to see. So we're talking about responses on the order of a few hundred milliseconds, maybe a second at the most, in terms of building a user interface that doesn't get in somebody's way. A CDS service also needs to obtain any data that it requires in order to actually provide advice. That could be information about a patient's demographics or lab tests, or medications or allergies or anything in their record. And one of the things that we've noticed is that different services have very different requirements for the kind of data they need. If you're building a service that focuses on anticoagulation therapy, there's a particular set of lab tests that you need. And you want to know somebody's medication doses for a particular set of medications. Those are the things that are really important for you. On the other hand, if you're building a bilirubin management tool, you need a totally different set of lab tests, and you need to know information about how long ago somebody was born. So the idea is in CDS hooks, we let these services request just the data that they want from the EHR, rather than having a conversation with the EHR up front to say, every time you call me, here are the things that I need. We try to decouple that discussion. And then, of course, the final responsibility for these services is to return the set of cards that I mentioned before. These are the user interface elements that a person would see. And over the wire, these cards that a service returns are just simple JSON objects. There's an example of one here that just displays a string, the string being example card. So that's sort of the hello world of what you can do with a card. But thinking more broadly, there's a particular set of fields that a card can define. One of the things that any card will do, since it's a user interface element that's going to be displayed to a clinician, is there's a flag indicating how urgent is this. Are we just talking about some FYI information here, or are we talking about something that should lead to a hard stop in a clinical workflow? And so we model that with this urgency indication flag. But more broadly, there's three basic types of cards that we have described. One is an information card. This is something that just gets displayed on the screen for a clinician to see. And the idea is this would typically be non-modal, so it's not interrupting you, but it's off to the side and it's visible and it's there for your information. Next up, which starts to get a bit more interesting, is what we've called a suggestion card. And so this actually comes with a button attached to it, which is a proposed change that a clinician might make to whatever they're doing in the EHR. So if you're prescribing a drug, a suggestion card might have a different prescription that you might want to consider instead. Different drug, different dose, and a little description about why you might want to consider that change. And then finally, the most general purpose here is an app link. The idea being, here's a link to a smart app or to a website that you might want to explore right now that's relevant for what you're doing. It might take you through a decision tree that's going to help you tailor drug therapy. It might take you through a prior authorization workflow that's going to make sure that you've documented everything you need to document in order to get this drug paid for. but literally any app that might be relevant to run right now. And then in collaboration with the community, we've started to expand this specification. And one example of something that came up very early in our collaborative development process was individuals who are working at companies doing decision support, writing these suggestions, had a strong need to say, well, we need to know when somebody took our suggestions. We need to know, for example, how often somebody clicked on the button that we proposed to change a drug or change a dose, so that we can start to build a feedback loop and improve our little taglines and our messages, figure out which language resonates with clinicians, which language drives the most change, as it were. So there's some modifications that we've made, some improvements to the specification to enable that kind of feedback loop to inform a service when a user clicks on those buttons. I want to highlight that CDS Hooks is very much a work in progress, and there's been a great community support around it. So the Argonaut program, which includes a set of EHR vendors as well as clinical organizations, has come together and taken this on as one of the topics for 2017 with the goal towards driving electronic health record adoption. We've got two main projects there inside of that Argonaut group. One is to flesh out the specification for the way we do those app links, and to make sure that linking to an app happens in an explicit way that's different from and provides a smoother user experience than just linking to any old web page. And also, Argonaut has undertaken a review of the security model for CDS Hooks. Our early focus had really been on working out the clinical exchanges. We have a set of specifications for security that needs to be vetted before wide-scale implementation. Another sort of community touch point that I already mentioned was our work with the clinical decision support work group within HL7. And we've undertaken a project to align what we're doing there. And of course, defining new hooks that meet new use cases. As we start to see broader implementation, I'm very excited about working through some of the performance aspects. First of all, making sure that we can measure the performance and the timing of these hooks. And then we have a few tricks up our sleeve for how we can improve things. But we want to make sure that we get some installation base and actually measure what's happening before we take too many steps to try to optimize. And then another topic that's pretty exciting for us is, what about asynchronous delivery? So what if you've got a hook that wants to listen for other kinds of events that are happening within the EHR system, like new data arriving, for example? Or what if you want to deliver a card, but the user who would see it isn't online right now? You just want it to be there when they get back. So those are some of the use cases around asynchronous delivery. And finally, I'll just say in terms of the community effort, we've had a tremendous number of, or tremendous turnout for a set of sessions that we've done around the HL7 Connectathon process, and many folks in the room here who have participated with us in those Connectathon sessions. We've been running a track at the HL7 FHIR Connectathon for the last 4 meetings straight, and we've had dozens of people participate, many full tables of developers, both on the EHR side, with folks from Cerner and Epic and Allscripts and Athena, working on some prototype implementations of these specifications, and then a number of companies that are building clinical decision support on the other side. And we'll share these slides. I've got links to the overview of these tracks within the HL7 FHIR Connectathon, but it's a great way to get involved if you're interested in exploring this specification and sit down and actually get to try out some development live over the course of a weekend. Last thing I want to show you here is a quick demonstration of what this looks like in our test harness. And demo.cdshooks.org is the landing page here, which has a public server with some sample data loaded into it, and what I would call a pretty low fidelity mock EHR. But the idea is to mock out just enough interactions that if you're developing a CDS service, you can use this as the EHR side to test your service and see what it looks like. And so in this test harness, the right-hand side of the screen here is basically debugging data. It's a FHIR representation of, in this case, the prescription that's being written. And the idea here is on the left-hand side of the screen is a pretty primitive prescribing pad. And as I make changes to my prescription, the debugging console will update and show what I've done. So for example, if I'm about to write a prescription for a drug, as I type in values here, once I choose a drug, this FHIR representation gets updated to show the particular instructions here, like take 1 pill once a day and a link to or a code for a particular drug product. So that's debugging information about what's happening behind the scenes. But over here on the left-hand side, in the part that the user would see, is an example of one of these cards that's being generated and displayed in line. And in this case, it's a pricing service. As soon as I choose a drug, the pricing service responds with a suggestion card because it notices that I've proposed a prescription for an expensive medication, which is a brand name drug, Zofran, where in practice there is a generic version available that is 95% less expensive. And so in this case, it's including a rationale here. You're spending $1,200. You could save just about $1,200 if you changed to a generic. And it includes a button here with a label that says change to generic. And so the test harness renders that card. And as a user, if I click on this button, my prescribing pad is going to be updated with the proposed changes. So in that case, it happens pretty quickly. Now I'm not prescribing Zofran anymore, but I'm prescribing the generic ondansetron. And you can see the card updated as well. So the EHR sent a new event to the external services and said, hey, now Josh is writing a prescription for this generic drug. And the service returned a card. In this case, it's just with an information card. No buttons, no links, just saying, by the way, this is a $56 prescription. So that's an idea of the kind of ambient information that we want to make available. As a clinician is going through the workflow, there's bonus information that's available off to the side where it's useful. It doesn't get in your way, but it's there for you if you want it. I want to give you a sense of some of the other kinds of interactions that we can enable here. So I'll show you an example of an app link card. So let's say, for example, I'm choosing a treatment intent here, and I say that I'm planning to make a prescription for hypertension. In this case, I'll get a card that shows up that says, you might want to use this app to tailor your therapy for hypertension. It's an app that's been designed specifically for these purposes, and it includes a link to the app, which is going to have the full context of who I am and what I was doing. If I click on this link, we're taken to the app, and here you can see it's a pretty primitive placeholder for what an app might be or might do. But this is a smart app that has access to the patient's demographics, has access to historical vital signs, medications, allergies, and it can take me through a decision tree where at the end I might say, yes, I want to choose the thiazide. And if I do, it sends me back to the EHR. A new card is generated saying, by the way, that's a $6 prescription. And that's an example of the kind of interaction pattern that we can enable with CDS hooks, with a card that links out to an app. The app helps me make a decision by gathering more information and then sends me back to the EHR system with a decision that I've made. And it updates within the user interface. I'll just say briefly, our main documentation site is cds-hooks.org, and there's links from there to the community site on a Google group and a live chat where you can join the discussion. With that, I will close out, and thank you very much.